Welcome to First But Last, brought to you by the Wyoming Humanities. I am your host, Emmy DeGrappa. Wyoming is called the Equality State because we were the first to give women the right to vote. 150 years later, we wonder what Wyoming women think about the progress toward equality now. Let's find out, and thank you for listening. Today, we are talking to Dr. Gigi Jasper. She is a retired African-American English teacher living in Rock Springs, Wyoming. Welcome, Gigi.
Well, thank you.
Where did you originally grow up before you moved to Rock Springs?
I grew up in Wisconsin. I grew up in Milwaukee, and my husband and I found our way to Wyoming in an odd way. We had both graduated and gone to South America, where we were for 6 months. And an old roommate said, if you want to get a job fast and earn money fast, come live with us in Gillette, Wyoming. So we looked at an atlas to see where Gillette, Wyoming was, and we came, and she was right. We were hired. We had no trouble getting jobs almost the same day. It was kind of astounding. I had never been in Wyoming, and to tell you the truth, had probably never given in Wyoming any thought whatever, except maybe for Yellowstone Park.
So you'd never been here before. You came because a friend said, if you want a job, come here. You got jobs. And then what was the rest of the story? So how did you end up staying for all these years?
All of these years. Well, like I said, we had come from South America, and we had started at Barranquilla, went all the way to Tierra del Fuego and back overland, which, by the way, I would not recommend. And when I got to Gillette, I was charmed, I have to admit. The streets were paved, and there was a library. Now, my husband was less enchanted than I was, but it looked like it was going to be a good place. And in many, many, many ways, it was. I don't think, if you'd asked me then, I would have said we were going to stay. And sometimes I'm still a little surprised that we did, given my experiences. But more than anything, I'm so conflicted, a little skitsy about my pros and cons of Wyoming. And at the end of the day, Wyoming has been very fortunate for me and for my husband. And that's why we stay.
So tell me about your husband, because you came together, you had different job opportunities, or was he an educator as well?
We were both English majors. But when he came to Gillette, he got a job almost instantly in the oil field, of course, at the very bottom of the rung. And I always thought that was astoundingly inappropriate job for him. But as time went on, he went all the way through the ranks and experienced pretty much everything an oil field worm to an oil field tool pusher does actually experience. Now, I first got a job, oddly enough. It was a short-term job because this was around April, and school wasn't going to be in session for long, but I was offered a job to be the librarian at the grade school. And I did that. And then I got offered a job to be a dispatcher at the police department. And I did that. And then I had an opportunity to apply for UPS for Christmas help. And they were paying astoundingly well. I think it was $6 an hour. And I did that. But prior to that, I had gotten the job at UPS because I had gone to job service. And as I was sitting right there in the job service office, somebody called from a construction company called N.A. Nelson and said, if you've got anybody who's breathing, send them over here. So I went. And I was told by whoever it was, we don't hire women. And he was saying that while there was a woman worker not 25 feet behind him. Well, it was pretty clear that my being female was not his objection. And so in some ways, my welcome to Wyoming was having to file with the EEOC.
Wow. And you hadn't been here that long?
No, months. not even, months. It was a very, very little time. Well, it got put off and extended, and it put off and extended. And I was an English major. I wrote extensive notes. I had extensive documentation. And the EEOC basically said, oh, well, we're overworked and underpaid, so nothing happened. So from then on, now N.A. Nelson was working on I-80. It was a federal project. I mean, all of it was pretty clear-cut, but they couldn't be bothered. So from then on, my husband and I called the EEOC, at least in Wyoming and at least at my experience, a rubber bone organization, because they were just exactly like giving a rubber bone to a starving dog.
Now, I guess that brings me into the question about race and about being a woman. So can you separate those in terms of what is it like to be a woman of color living in Wyoming versus what is it like to be a woman living in Wyoming? Or do they just meld together?
For me personally, they kind of meld. I wouldn't say one was more difficult than the other, but I know why. After we were kind of both transferred to Rock Springs, I believed I had never been any place. In fact, if it hadn't been for the unpleasantness with the N.A. Nelson Company, my feeling was I'd never been any place where you were judged more by the quality of your work than by who you were. So I have to admit, I was quite stunned that I had to even fight that battle to begin with. And now my being Black, even still, after all these years, and we got to Wyoming in 1975, even still, I see disbelief, I think, that I'm Black. I think it's kind of funny. And I understand that's grounded in total racism. They're mostly, the reaction I get when it is negative is, how on earth is it possible for you to conjugate the verb to be? And in fact, that was one of the things that I wrote many years later that I called the Proof Defect. And the Proof Defect, and here's my English majorism coming out big time, the Proof Defect for me was that look some people give you, which exactly mirrors how you would look at your dog if she turned to you one day and said, for a long time, I used to get up early, which is the first line in Proust Swan's Way. And that's that look.
So I guess explain that look to me, because yes, you were living in a very much all-white rural community. And would you say it's still that way?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I do know. Now, it has been modified because I am now the exception. You know, I'm the exception because, I'm dangerously overeducated, and I have had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of students who now know me and not just what they think they know when they see me for the first time. But it is a look of such stunned disbelief, as if folks are looking at something they could not conceive of ever existing. Years ago, I was asked, I was talking about something, and he said to me, "You don't have a Southern accent." And I said, "I'm not from the South." And I watched him think about that. It was as if it had never occurred to him that anybody with a black face wouldn't have a Southern accent.
Well, that's really interesting. But I guess, is it that a lot of your students, or I don't know, maybe it wasn't your students, but people who live around you just have never experienced a black person?
That is absolutely true. That is absolutely true. And when I was working for UPS, I was delivering in Cokeville, and I drove to Cokeville every day, and it was real early in UPS's tenure in Wyoming. And I noticed that I must have been making kind of a difference, because I went to make a delivery at the school, and at that time, the high school and the grade school, they were all kind of connected. And in the kindergarten wing, there was a picture, and the the poster said something like, people you see every day. And there was a little brown woman in a little brown outfit carrying a little brown package. And I thought, doggone, that's me. So, yes, it is true that there were, well, it's true now. Virtually none of my students had ever had a black teacher before. And not only that, they probably never will. But, and this is what always gave me joy and kept me teaching for 29 years, the amazement wasn't hostile. Okay. More often than not. Now, occasionally it was, and that led to another ugly incident, but oftentimes it was just pure amazement. But sometimes it just wasn't. The notion that many teachers of color have to prove that I'm worthy to teach them because it is inconceivable that I would know more than they, even if they're 15.
Did you feel isolated because you weren't near other people of color that you could relate to?
Less so than one might think. There are kind of notable Rock Springs black families. And when we first got here, many people kept trying to put me in one of those families. And maybe I was sort of acceptable if I had been from one of those families to begin with, because clearly I would have to be, because why else would I be there? But my isolation was sort of reduced by the good women friends I made early on. And again, they were friends that I made kind of by accident that turned out to be shakers and movers and women who were activists in women's rights and activists in rape counseling. So I was not as isolated as one might think. And when I became a teacher in Rock Springs, kind of by accident, there was never any question that I was equipped academically, and in fact, probably better equipped than some teachers to do exactly what I was doing. So there was that grudging admiration from some, and from others, just plain old-fashioned acceptance from the get-go. There may be a couple of reasons for that. It may be that Rock Springs has a lot of really fine people. It also may be that it's hard to be afraid and hate people you don't actually see. There really are not and were not that many people of color in Rock Springs. Certainly not in the 70s and the 80s.
Does that surprise you because of the oil boom, and usually that brings in a number of different people from other cultures and other places?
It may have done, but I lived in a different world. So I wouldn't have seen it. My husband would have been more likely to see it. And he's told me that when he would go and pick up his crew, he said 90% of the time, a new person would come in, get in the car, and the first thing they do is tell a nigger joke. Now we know, but think about that. We know what that means. They were trying to find friend, foe. They were trying to find what group they were in, and they wanted to know how to play it. He said it happened all the time. But we do, as individuals in society, look for our place. And that's a crude, stupid, backward way of doing it, but it is also a very common way of doing it. It could have just as easily, or maybe not just as easily, but it could have also been a woman-bashing joke. You know, I'm one of the gang, because we're all men here and we can bash women.
So you've experienced institutionalized racism being an African American and being an African American woman.
Oh, sadly, yes. Sadly, yes. It blew up to the most dramatic time when I was teaching, and a student, although he was not, never had been one of mine, came in and threw a piece of furniture at me and was calling me an effing nigger bitch and how I should go back and pick cotton. I didn't know this kid. I didn't know him. I didn't know him. He was just a rather rabid racist. Now, it didn't turn out well for him because After being turned down by every single organization I was raised to believe was there to assist me, my husband and I hired an attorney. And fortunately, this kid was 18. So we sued the kid and the school district, because the school district virtually said nothing happened either. And after 3 years of an ugly fight and countlessly having our house egged and having our windows shot, we won. We won. But here's the thing that is making me insane. I read an article day before yesterday about all of the teachers in this nation who are being kicked and punched and hurt and are suffering in silence. Now that makes me want to just scream, because if one allows that kind of abuse, then it becomes acceptable. And that was the motivation when my husband and I decided that we were going to sue. If that is allowed to happen to one teacher, it will happen to any teacher.
And was this a recent article?
In fact, yes, very recent, a couple days ago.
That is shocking.
It is shocking and so demoralizing. Becoming a teacher is not something younger people now put on their list to do, which is why there's a shortage of teachers nationwide. So instead of lauding those people who do it, they are very often ignored and underpaid. Now, there are some twists in some of it. There are different laws, evidently, for what happens to a special education teacher inflicted by the student, which I believe needs to be changed. But in this article, these were not mostly special education teachers, and they were just, some of them were afraid to tell, and I can't even remember why, because it was such a specious argument. Some of them just weren't fighters, and I don't understand that either, because if you won't fight for yourself, why would one expect anyone to fight for you? But it is a very big deal. And in my case, life changed for a number of teachers, I think, when we won, because it was very public. It was pretty ugly. It should never have happened and would not have happened if I'd gotten any satisfaction, i.e. an apology, but I didn't. But after that, some teachers sort of felt like, one teacher said to me, somebody said something nasty to them, and they turned to her and said, "I'm going to tell Gigi." And that was kind of the end of that.
That's funny.
I had no idea that some little crazy teacher could sue them and make them pay her. But once it's done, it sort of set a tone.
Well, I can see why reading an article like that just recently, and especially in light of what happened to you, but thank God you were victorious in that situation, but that it's still going on. But is it racially motivated?
No, it doesn't seem to be. It does not seem to be racially motivated. And that is another thing that makes me just scratch my head in disbelief. A lot of it is very, very bad behavior by poorly raised children. And then no support, not enough support by the powers that be. Now, the end of this article talked about how in this particular district, they were going to form a task force to look into it and investigate everything. My feeling is, well, now, that's a real good way to never have to deal with something again. Form a committee to look into it.
Yeah, that'll never happen, right? It'll just stay in the committee.
Exactly.
So what are the things that you are doing or have done that mentor other young women of color in the community, or young people? People.
I rarely had a black student, and I always loved it when I did, because it was so interesting, because I knew that he or she had probably not had a black teacher before, and I was kind of a character. But one of the advantages, and this is again that dualism, I was oftentimes looked at as the sole representative of all Black women in the world, the end, which is ridiculous. On the other hand, I was the sole representative of all Black women in the United States to these kids who've never known one. So it was my age and my experience that allowed me to say things I might not have said in a different setting. I think that if students were to say what they most remembered about me was that I tried to teach them to fight back. Don't roll over and play dead, period. Because it is true. There are times when one has to stand up for what you believe, even if you're the only one on your feet, period. You've got to do it. And maybe that's what I'm most proud of. I was saying, this was a few years ago, I was talking about consciousness-raising groups from the 1970s and 80s and what women did in Rock Springs. And one of my students said right in class, well, why don't you start it again? And she caught me up short, probably because I fought that fight once, and it's now their term. But they didn't even know the term CR group. They never heard it. And so I had students who believed absolutely that racism was something that Martin Luther King had taken care of, that sexism really didn't exist too much, that all women got paid the same amount of men for doing the same job. They really, 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 really believe that. And I'm not sure I convinced too many. Well, I might have convinced some that it wasn't true. When I was in high school, many years ago, and I was in high school, I think the average wage for women versus men was something like 72 cents an hour. 72 cents as opposed to $1. And I said, excuse me for not being overwhelmed at those few pennies difference since I graduated from high school in 1970.
Wow. You have so many great stories, and I so appreciate your time. And I love that you're still a fighter, an overcomer, and you still have such a strong, wise voice. Thank you so much, Gigi.
Oh, thank you so very much.
Thank you for listening to First But Last, brought to you by the Wyoming Humanities. Please join us again next week as we continue our conversations with women from around the state. You can also find us at thinkwy.org, where we continue the conversation on our blog about the history, journey, and the challenges of Wyoming's intrepid women living in the equality state. And if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the show and leave us a review on iTunes. Thank you for listening.